Lots of proprietary software I can't really talk about. Some of it is, some of my duties are InfoSec related, but nothing exciting enough to be on stage and talk to you for an hour about. So I will talk to you about something that is more exciting. Yay, suicide risk assessment. So I also know several of you probably from building blinky flashy things. Also in my off time, I am a suicide intervention counselor. So I'll explain kind of what that is and how that relates to our community and what we can be doing better. So also, if you can make it through the next 30 seconds, I promise this will be the most depressing part of the entire hour. It was my goal to present an entirely non-depressing, non-depression-oriented panel. So if you know me, I am kind of a happy person, but I did not actually decide to become a suicide intervention counselor because it was full of unicorns and rainbows. It was because there were 2 suicides in my family a few years apart when I was in college. And then a few years later, my mother was diagnosed with cancer. And she has recovered fantastically. But at the time, I was mortified that if her treatment went the wrong way, I was going to lose her too. So I reacted as some nerds might, and I freaked out and started learning everything I could about suicide. The result of that was that I ended up volunteering, which was a difficult process to get trained, to learn, to confront a lot of demons. But now I think that it was definitely worthwhile, and learning about it took a lot of the fear out of it, and hopefully that skill set is something that I can transfer to you. A lot of it is not rocket science. I don't know if it's necessarily common sense if you're not incredibly well-versed in maybe linguistics or how to talk to people, which maybe is something sometimes our community is not so great at. But it can be taught, it can be learned, it is a skill set. So that's what we're going to go through. So let's go ahead and start. So before we begin, this came up on the Twitters yesterday in the midst of the Boston marathon bombing. And I just, for some reason, I kind of felt the need to address what happened yesterday, even though it doesn't really seem related. But as it was happening, I was getting messages from people saying, "This is ridiculous. I'm so glad you're talking tomorrow." It's like, well, I'm not talking about that. What does one thing have to do with another thing? But I meditated on it a little bit, and I came up with this image basically encapsulating that. And it's Mr. Rogers, who we love, saying, "When I was a boy and I would see scary things in the news, my mother would say to me, 'Look for the helpers. You'll always find people who are helping.'" And it's easy to look for who's running in and who the helpers are in a tragedy when you see it on the news. But every day, when you can't see the tragedy, when it's not so obvious, or when someone is upset, or when it's our friends, when you don't know what the end game or the win state is, it's hard to be a helper and it's hard to really know what to do. So I don't think that we lack helpers in this community, but I think we lack know-how. So, as I said, this won't be depressing. Trigger warning. There is a discussion of mental health. If you feel in any way uncomfortable, feel free to get up, go outside, take a phone call. We will not judge you. However, like I said initially, what's not depressing about learning about suicide intervention is that as you learn, things become demystified. You remove the cloud of war. You remove the confusion, and you can confront things for what they really are. So what they really are, sadly, if you look at the numbers, suicide is the 10th most common cause of death in the United States, according to the 2010 CDC data. If you look at every other item on that list, they are disease-related. I also run a lot of races and stuff in New York. If you follow me on Twitter, you know I post about them all the time. I think I've run a race benefiting every other one of these things. Why don't we ever do a suicide prevention race? What is it that is different? So I think that has a lot to do with the social stigma, and we'll get to that in a second. Not going to start a guns debate, but in our national dialogue about gun prevention, I'm not sure if anyone has ever noticed, first of all, more than twice the number of people in the United States die by suicide every year than by homicide. And when you look at involving a firearm, homicide involving a firearm, 11,000 in 2010, 19,000, almost twice as many suicides involving a firearm. I don't think I've ever heard our national discussion of firearm control involve suicide. Okay. So across all age groups, here's just your numbers graph, so you can see there are numbers behind this. Suicide is generally considered a disease of the young, and that is not because it disproportionately affects people based percentage-wise. It's actually somewhat less in the younger years, but because nothing else is killing you. So as you get towards the other end of the spectrum, the overall morbidity rate is increasing. But let's talk about the age groups that we see here. Suicide is actually third behind accidents and homicides for males aged 15 to 24. It is the third most common cause of death. If you are 25 to 34, it is second only to accidental death. That's it. If you look at the graph at the bottom here, the suicide rate is tracked in the red line, and then you have the Vietnam War and the HIV/AIDS crisis in the blue bars. The age, the demographic that you're capturing here is just 18 to 34, so this is just men that would have been military age, so that the apples-to-apples comparison of the Vietnam data. So you can see there is a spike during the war, but overall, the number of deaths, you catch up to that on either side with the suicide rate, and then during the peak of the HIV/AIDS crisis, it barely went over the number every year of suicides in that age group. And what's somewhat disheartening to note is that while our HIV/AIDS treatment has gotten better, as you come off this graph out of the 90s and into the 2000s, the suicide rate has remained essentially steady. So, yet still, not running any races for this, not quite sure why. If you're wondering why in the 60s it seems like there is such an increase, there's two main reasons. One of them is that there were more suicides. A lot of that had to do with returning vets from the war and an altering drug and social structure in America, which I'm sure we're all aware of. The second being better reporting. Medical examiners started recording data more accurately because of the social stigma, especially if you were in a religious hospital. They would often record your death as non-suicide, even if it was suicide. So the older data tends to be very unreliable. So, speaking of stigma, history of stigma, this is the first thing we're going to learn when we are talking about suicide in our community or any community. We're going to stop saying people committed suicide. It is not a clinical term, and that harkens back to a social stigma when suicide was a crime against the church and a crime against the state. Even the Catholic Church in the 80s, it's no longer considered an ecclesiastical crime. And in the U.S., it also hasn't been considered a crime for a little bit longer than that. So I remember still when I was a kid, there was the riddle of what's the only crime you can only get arrested if you fail, and the answer was supposed to be suicide. So we want to stop saying committed, and we also want to stop saying successful and failure because it kind of gives the wrong impression. So the history of mental health treatment in the United States explains a lot of why people don't want to talk to each other about this. We have a terrible history. If you look around 1900, this is us literally putting mental patients in a box. Around the 50s, this is when we were melting down the shackles, when we were no longer shackling people in asylums. We melted them down and made this is the mental health freedom bell that's supposed to represent a change in the overall ideology of mental health in the country. So we also have all these asylums left over. That this was an art project that was done to one that was closed down after being in operation for 90 years. They planted 28,000 flowers throughout the asylum to symbolize the regrowth there. So while we have this history that seems to be getting better, if you look at about this, around the 60s, around the post-Vietnam era, around the time where your suicide rate is increasing, you also found a federal program of deinstitutionalization. That happened under Kennedy, and it was supposed to be a change in funding from state-based funding of these asylums, which they couldn't shoulder the burden of anymore because our moral imperative to take care of people only went so far as we could pay for it, and they were just overburdened. And shifted to the federal government. So they said, well, we can't take care of people either, so we're going to let the communities take care of them, so let's release everyone. So this is why you see a intense spike in homelessness and mental illness in the homeless during the 60s and the 70s, which we're still dealing with, especially I live in New York, still dealing with that as they try to clean up Times Square. So we hear a lot, coming down to our group more, we hear a lot about artists and writers and poets that kill themselves. We don't often hear a lot about mathematicians and scientists, but the same spark that gives people creativity in an artistic realm also tends to lead the same people to be inventors and mathematicians. And this list is just a selection from the last 100 years. I would also recommend no one win a Nobel Prize in chemistry. So you might see some other, some interesting names like George Eastman from Eastman Kodak, and through every field. So as you see, we're kind of narrowing down here. Next slide. Here's some computer science. There's mostly I picked it up from around 2000. Before that, there were two notable ones of Alan Turing and one of the very first women in computing. Alan Turing ingested cyanide. There's also a common urban legend that the Apple logo is supposed to be, he was obsessed with Snow White, and so he was thought to have committed suicide by ingesting his nightly apple with cyanide and then eating it. And so there was this thing that the Apple logo was supposed to be an homage to him with the bite out of it. Turns out that's totally false. The bite was just provided so people know it's not a cherry. But it's kind of this myth or this kind of lore in the way that his suicide has been kind of indoctrinated into the computer culture. So moving down the list, I want to say that I made every effort to treat the line items here in exactly the same way as I did the scientists on the last slide, that being that I pulled them from the Wikipedia bios, because I know there are people on this list that we know, and it was incredibly difficult to encapsulate their contribution into a line in a spreadsheet. So, but I tried to do that as impartially as possible. And I think that what's difficult to see is that the rate seems to be kind of increasing. We've lost several people in the last few years. And after Aaron's death was when, surprisingly, I guess because people know that I do this intervention online, they contacted me. More than a couple people contacted me. And they said that they were concerned about their friends. I don't know if it's their friends or really their friends. But that they were kind of scared. They didn't know what to say to them. They didn't know what not to say to them. And that was when I first got the inkling that this was something that I should really be doing for our community, because contagion is a real thing. The CDC has contagion guidelines, and contagion is when a suicide happens in a specific community, especially if someone who's well-respected or very visible, that there tends to be imitations or after effects or clusters shortly thereafter. The first documented case of that is called the Werther effect. That's where the name comes from. It's the book there, all the way on the side. That's from von Goethe. He also wrote Faust, if you've ever read that. The book was called The Sorrows of Young Werther. And it was about a young lover who, in a fit of, his lover marries another man. He writes a suicide note, puts on a yellow jacket, and shoots himself in the head. There were so many imitations of this that Germany banned the book in the next year. So that's where we first got the name from. Middle one is not Godzilla. He did not commit suicide. But Godzilla was entombed in Mount Mihara. Mount Mihara is part of Japanese folklore because in the 30s there was a young schoolgirl who threw herself into the volcano thinking that her ashes would ascend to heaven, and it inspired a few of her friends to follow suit. It got picked up by the media. It was a very popular story. People started going to see where it happened. An entire tourism industry built up over 3 years around this. And there were actually like an amusement park where you could kind of simulate the ride down the mountain that they built. They would not sell one-way tickets to the island, but it was still, this is what you were there for. Over the next 3 years, 1,000 people threw themselves into the volcano. Eventually, the state had to shut it down entirely. And then the Golden Gate Bridge, if you live in America, you've heard the phrase, go throw yourself off the Golden Gate Bridge. So this is just how these become entrenched in our minds, and contagion is a real risk. So I was concerned. So what can we do if we're recognizing that this is a concern in our community in the way that we need to speak about suicide? Well, we already discussed the first thing, to stop saying committed. Second, the rest of the things of what we should say on here, this is like being on message. We want to say that suicide is never the result of a single factor or event. It is the result of extremely complex interactions, and that it most often is the result of a long history of problems. So not a singular event. Okay, I'm trying to make my preview a little bigger here. There we go. Now I can read it. So we don't want to present suicide as a means to a certain end or a valid coping mechanism, and we don't want to make venerating statements, especially out of context on the things on the side. So saying, oh, she was a great kid with a bright future, it doesn't really help. Now, we live in an interesting age now with social media and us all being bloggers and every word that we say being documented. And it's a totally valid point that we want to document our grief. And we want to say how we feel. Hopefully we can do this in a responsible way that takes into account when we need to talk about these things, putting them in context of it being a larger issue for the person involved and the end of a long journey, and not being a singular event. So the media response is very difficult to control. Right now, we focus on counseling potentially affected groups after the incident to prevent the contagion, because you can't really say no comment and you can't really control what the media does. So much love to the EFF, but right now, if you have noticed, their Twitter icon has Aaron's face with a Stop the CFAA label on it. I will leave it to you to consider how many of these guidelines that violates. Okay, so now we're going to dig a little deeper. I'm not going to talk about anything specific, any of our specific people anymore, but we're going to talk about some clinical terms here. So, suicidal ideation, this is thinking about suicide. Intent is a intent to act. Attempt is actually going through with the act, but not taking it through to fatality. An aborted suicide attempt would be beginning the attempt, but then for some reason stopping before harm was caused. Maybe there was an intervention, maybe you had second thoughts, it could be a lot of different reasons that it becomes aborted. None of these things do you ever, again, want to say successful versus failure. It's either completed or not completed. Self-harm, different than any of these other things, because they're not, the end game there isn't fatality. So when you talk about harm reduction, and if you haven't watched Violet Blue's harm reduction in the hacker community talk from 29C3, it's on YouTube and it's a good watch. It's mostly about OPSEC. But she does mention some harm reduction strategies that you can use for mostly for drug use. Also in the self-harm arena, it's around like having clean blades if you're going to cut yourself. It's about making sure that you don't intend to die, you don't die. None of that harm reduction applies to the suicide arena because the end game is death. So there is no way to harm reduce it. Also, as a side note, whenever we talk about drug or alcohol use throughout in relation to suicide intervention, it's a total just say no attitude. And that's not, again, because we are not cool or because we don't believe in harm reduction, but because it's so common to have interaction between depression or a depressed state and alcohol or mood-altering substances creating a very volatile situation that there's not really a safe way to do it. Okay. PIC is an abbreviation, person in crisis. You'll see it on some of the slides. Risk assessment is where we're going to talk about defining low, medium, high for an overall sort of a person based on their characteristics. Threat assessment would be a specific event. I'm sure a lot of you are probably already familiar with the terms risk assessment and threat analysis. So we're going to take those exact same strategies and we're going to apply them to a new data set. Mental illness is most closely related to suicide. Not really going to go into this too deeply. If you want to read the Wikipedia pages, they're fascinating. Or I don't recommend WebMD, but they most closely related with suicide would be depression and manic depression, which is bipolarism. Personality disorders are also closely related. Mostly, I would say, the borderline personality disorders, which are considered cluster B there. Avoidant dependent, obsessive compulsive disorders, all of these things manifest themselves when people are in the thick of an expression of that phase. They're much more likely to go through with suicide. So we're going to step back. Quick sidebar. This is the only slide that we have on depression since we're not doing a depression panel, but a period of depression is not the same as having a mood disorder. We all go through periods of depression. It usually means it's definitely less than a month, most often less than 2 weeks. Sometimes you need to cultivate happiness, create the world around you. These things are helpful to someone who is going through a period of depression, maybe because of a breakup or an isolated incident. Someone who has a clinical mood disorder cannot just snap out of it. And telling them to do so, besides likely getting you punched in the face, makes them feel very disconnected. So when you talk to somebody who maybe is really down, I would avoid saying these happy-making statements. They just don't get through. And you can probably relate to that as well. If anybody ever tells you, like, well, why don't you just go take a walk or exercise when you're feeling down? It generally it doesn't really help. Maybe that's just me. But on the good side, depression and manic depression kind of ebbs and flows in its severity. So you can use the times where you're in a lull to create proactive, preventative crisis plans for the bad times. And we'll talk about how to do that later. And then these are things we can talk about at happy hour. I'm not going to talk about them here intentionally. Same thing during the Q&A. If you want to ask me questions about any of these topics that you see here, we'll talk about them later. They are all philosophical questions. Fantastic, really exciting topics, not in any way pragmatically helpful for getting anyone through a suicidal crisis. So, jumping back to mental illness correlation, you can see that the strongest the strongest indicator of a future death by suicide is a previous suicide attempt. In fact, you are 38 times more likely to die by suicide if you have previously attempted it. That's because most people do not complete suicide on the first time, and doing it once reduces your threshold barrier so that you're more likely to do it again, and also you know more stuff. So very, very strongly correlated. Then you see the mood disorders. Most of these things you see comorbid with each other. So you'll see alcoholism along with depression. It's kind of a chicken and the egg thing. What's kind of interesting to point out is actually the medical illnesses at the bottom. So AIDS, Huntington's disease, MS, cancer, these are things that people would think correlate strongly with higher suicide risk. Actually, fallacious. That's totally not true. Not saying that people with terminal illnesses do not kill themselves. They do, and at a somewhat higher rate. But generally, it is in the presence of one of the mental illnesses that you'll see at the top. Generally not by themselves. Yeah. 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 So anxiety disorders are continuous or episodic worries or fears, so your panic attacks, your ongoing anxiety, they're considered separate from mood disorders, which are just depression or manic depression. Gotcha. All right. Also, there's a lot of text on this stuff, I know that, so the slides will be available for download pending some licensing issues. Okay. One thing that is not on this slide is autism or autism spectrum or Asperger's, which I know we're concerned about in this community. That's because there's a slightly elevated suicide risk, not even enough to get on the chart. And furthermore, we don't have any data that actually indicates there is a higher tendency towards Asperger's other than some anecdotal evidence. So until we have that, we should probably stop talking about it all the time. Okay. So, coming to our community specifically, and you'll note there are a lot of special snowflakes there. So, this is one example. This is underdiagnosis of mood disorders, and so I just took one kind of archetype. So, talking about startup culture and the show, which was a blogger that wrote about the show a few weeks ago, and I totally did not credit him. I need to put the link on. But in that startup culture, that archetype is where mania is your desired state, depression is stigmatized, you have this constant cycle of youth and burnout, you're working for sweat equity, so you're chronically underinsured, and drug and alcohol use is trivialized, expected. It's very hard to notice when somebody crosses the line from okay party drugs to like, this is maybe not okay. So I came up with, I'll sleep when I'm dead, I'm busy crushing it. Probably not so healthy. So this kind of attitude indicates almost a classic manic depressive kind of person, except you're only allowed to ever express the mania portion. So when you go through any other state, you can't really talk about it, and that just exacerbates the problem. And there's a lot of people in the startup community that are starting to talk about it. They actually just had Jody Sherman, who is well known for starting EcoMom, recently killed himself. So their community is also talking about this. But let's talk about personality disorders. Yeah.
Sorry, so are you suggesting that there are
I'm suggesting that it may, well, possibly, but even if it is the same as the general population, which is kind of what I mean by the special snowflakes, it doesn't necessarily have to be a higher, it's that it's underdiagnosed and we're not catching it. Same thing with the personality disorders. So think of some these catchphrases: antisocial behavior, paranoia, isolation, obsession. This sounds like all of my best friends. So these traits are expected in this community, and here I guess we are talking about literally this community right here. But they're expected. They're not only expected, they're tolerated. It's okay if you're kind of an asshole. Like, people just expect you to not want to talk to people. In some senses, they're encouraged. You can, like, hammer things out for 3 days without sleeping. That's great. And in some ways, they're even idolized. And this comes down to how we treat Asperger's in this community now. Whether or not it's even true that it's more prevalent. We look at it as a gift or something that's beneficial. And that's not necessarily bad. We'll get to that in 1 second. But, and my phrase down here, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not after you, reminded me of an anecdote of a friend to typify our community who said, God, my phone battery is so hot because the feds or somebody are just listening to me all the time. And everybody around was like, you should put your phone in the freezer. So I think in any other community, people would be like, maybe you should get that checked out. But there is a legit chance that he's not paranoid. And that can lead, when we get to triggers and talking about actual risk assessment, that leads to a very interesting kind of a risk profile and threat profile. Because you have to take things seriously that in the general population you really would be outlandish. So when it comes to talking about these things as gifts, there are a lot of people that look at a disorder, especially like being manic depressive, as brilliant madness. There's a great book by K. Redfield Jamison called Touched with Fire. It deals more with the artistic community, but you can also think of it as the technical community, if, you know, artists, technical, whatever. And there's some other books there. The Icarus Project is an entire website dedicated to figuring out how to make these things constructive for you. So they're not necessarily bad. And not everybody exists in like a 10 off-the-charts scale where you're non-productive. So there's a legitimate need in a lot of people to not want to diagnose themselves, or to diagnose but not want to medicate. Maybe you don't want to lose that gift. Maybe you want to work around it. Maybe you want to find out how to work with it. And that's totally legitimate. So what do we do then? Where do we go? Well, we go online. That is what we do. Crowdsourced intervention, a fickle mistress. So this is about, oh wow, you really can't see those slides. It's really bright. That's too bad. It's actually this is a really good post from Hacker News, where someone was talking about, after Aaron's death, being concerned about the Werther effect and laying out some steps that people should do for themselves. It was a great post. The next one, of course, the one that printed out just fine, is from /B, and is a bunch of crap about somebody saying, like, you feel suicidal, why don't you get on a plane and go have an adventure, and then you'll see how great life is. It's like traditional copy pasta. And then the last one is on Reddit. Only Reddit people would understand someone saying, I'm going to kill myself in a few hours, AMA. And then just like fielding questions for a while. So some of the responses were good, but the one that I posted is a good example because it's a great philosophical response. It kind of cuts to the heart of what it means to live, and was very uplifting, and everybody, it got rated top comment, and the guy was like, thanks. Just like I said at the beginning, rhetoric and philosophical arguments don't help in that sort of situation. You need to talk to the person about their specific problems and get them into a situation that will de-escalate their mental state. You don't need to convince them. You're not going to win. And as the last one, this came up on Imgur while I was literally putting my slides together. This was on the front page one day. So this was a girl who posted, you know, life is too tough, thanks for all the lulz, with the space picture. Somebody got concerned. They reposted it and said, we have to find that fat cat. Is she all right? They managed to figure out who she was, got on Twitter, got in touch with her family. It turned out, yes, she had taken a whole bottle of pills, ended up in the hospital, survived, mostly because antidepressants today mostly won't kill you, like the ones of the 50s did. So she posted a picture with her cat, like, hey guys, thanks, that was great. Then somebody read the rest of the comments she had posted on other people's pictures, and it turned out maybe she wasn't an angel. And you can't read this here, but she said, kill yourself, asshat. pick up your dignity, whore, God hates fags. Some really nice ones from this girl. So at that point, the Imager community, who loves to pride themselves on restoring faith in humanity, realized that maybe they had helped somebody unconditionally who maybe should have been conditional. And they reacted with, fuck you, you hypocritical cunt. I looked through your pictures and there's like 10 telling people to kill yourself. And my favorite, signed in just to downvote. So, internet, general, not a good place to go for crisis response. Now we're going to move on. This is a better online place to go for crisis response. This is I'm Alive. They take the same thing that you would do for a phone hotline and they do it online. So this is where I started volunteering a while ago because I'm more comfortable and I'm used to IRC. This is like where I would have gone. However, in the process of being there, I realized that it maybe wasn't what I thought it was. They get a lot of traffic from teenagers. They get a lot of traffic from, I guess, the general cross-cut of Americans, but not really the same people that I thought would go. Not really anybody from our community. And even if anybody here were to go there, there's no way to get matched up with anybody who knows what the hell you're talking about if you want to talk about anything specific. Or use big words. They're very kind of well-meaning people, a lot of psych students. They do a good job with what they do. It's about as efficacious as calling a hotline. And that's not a bad thing, but it made me realize that instead what we needed to do was take the skills that they taught me to do that sort of intervention and instead teach it to our community so that we can do a better job internally for ourselves. If anybody wants to pick up a project and do something helpful for society, they're also using like some sort of Java-based web chat to do this, and they say that it's anonymous, but the only thing they mean by anonymous is you don't have to give them your name. Unlike calling a phone hotline, they won't call you back, they won't send an ambulance to your house, they don't do anything with figuring out where your IP is coming from, they don't store any information. That's based on their policy. But they also don't train their staff or have any information about how to remove traces that you've been there. Unlike calling, like people know since the 70s, if you don't want somebody to see a suicide hotline show up on your phone bill, you call from somewhere that's not your house. They're not giving that sort of information out, and there is a strong correlation between domestic abuse and suicide. There's a lot of people who want to reach out but are really afraid, and they think that going online is going to be safer than making a phone call. And it's not necessarily. In fact, at the end of your session, whether you're anonymous or not, the volunteer is supposed to ask, can you give me your email address so we can get in touch with you next week? And that's partially because that's the only way they can get any information back. There's really no other way to find out if what you've done helped, but other than to get a positive response back. You can give them any email you want, but without providing any sort of further information about, hey, are you sure nobody's reading your email? Is it okay that you're here today? It could be, I thought it was a little bit irresponsible, but not to bash them, they're providing a great service. But what we're going to do is we're going to take the training that they gave me, and I'm going to present that to you. First, the next section of slides, disclaimer. This is from the QPR Institute, this is the gatekeeper training. This is their training that you're supposed to present at a community center. You could do it as like a boardroom training. I'm under license with them, having learned it, to not alter it at all. I'm not allowed to change the order, the wording, maybe not supposed to put anything in front of it or behind it, but whatever. So what's in here, consider this foundational. It is geared to the lowest common denominator of people, and once we quick run through these slides, this is going to be the input to actually talking about the specific intervention tactics that I learned for the online response, which was a separate program. So, what's QPR? Ask a question, save a life. Question, persuade, refer. That is QPR. This is not intended to be a form of counseling or treatment. It is intended to offer hope through positive action. So what we're trying to do is get people to admit they have a problem and get them to a better place. So here are some common myths. We've probably talked about most of these already earlier. The gist being that you can make a difference. Regular people, by asking the right questions and stepping up to the plate and actually saying something, can challenge someone and get them the help they need. So one to highlight is the myth of those who talk about suicide don't do it. That's definitely not true. I know there's a concept of attention whores or people who cry wolf, but it generally means that there's a psychological problem there that does need to be addressed. So we need to take those seriously. And then at the top, that people keep their plans to themselves is not true. About 70% of people do tell someone before they actually kill themselves. So more signs you see, greater the risk, take all signs seriously. Here are some direct verbal cues for those of us who are somewhat not socially gifted. I've decided to kill myself, I wish I were dead. These are the sorts of things that should really indicate to you there is a suicide risk. You're going to want to step in. Indirect verbal cues are more like, oh, I just want to get out, or I won't be around much longer. Anything that sounds very foreshadowy is an indicator. Behavioral clues. We'll address these on the actual risk assessment. Most of these indicate that a trigger event has happened. Situational cues, these are, again, like something that's happening. And here we go. Okay. So the S question, this is the crux of their entire program. This is about actually asking about, are you thinking about suicide? It seems ridiculously simple, but much like talking about sex, which I guess would be the other S question, it's very uncomfortable. People don't want to do it. It's much easier to say, like, you know, you're not going to do anything stupid, right, before somebody goes home, which is the absolute answer, the question that you never want to ask, because no one will ever tell you yes. People will tell you what they want to hear, so you have to sit them down, create a bit of a space, and just ask them in the face what they're thinking. It helps if you have some time to talk freely and some resources, that sort of a thing. Then they give you a few approaches. These are pretty cheese, but maybe it will help you. Do you ever wish you could go to sleep and never wake up? You know, I guess it depends. You can create your own rapport. I'm more of a direct approach kind of a person. But you can feel free, if you ever need to actually ask this sort of question to somebody, you can feel free to blame it on me in the training and say, I saw a list of like 20 things that are considered risk factors, and I think you're doing 15 of them. Have you actually considered suicide? That's probably the easiest way. It helps if you have evidence, if you want to talk to them about it. And maybe the next biggest fallacy is that people will lie to you. They don't really. For the most part, they are very surprised and like kind of like popping the meniscus on a glass of water. It's just they let it all out because it's this secret that people are hiding. And once you break through that, they will just tell you stuff, for better or worse. So again, here's the one question, the one thing you never say to someone who you would think might be suicidal. You're not suicidal, are you? They will always tell you no. So give a question that has a positive sort of response where they can say yes. So persuading someone to stay alive, we're going to do a lot of, the later slides are mostly active listening, like some serious like syntax and things. So for the most part, the most important part of this slide is don't rush to judgment. Don't ask people a question you don't want to hear the answer to. Or if you are going to do it because it's important to you, be prepared for what they're going to say and be prepared to be non-judgmental about it. You're going to need to get them to accept better help than you. That's really the whole goal. So in order to do that, you have to hear what they are saying, hopefully de-escalate the situation a little bit depending on how crisis-y they are, and then move them to a safer place. And you don't need to enact this as suicide intervention all the time. If we just talk to each other more frequently about how we were feeling or things that were crappy, we probably wouldn't get to this point. So maybe talking to people and being non-judgmental in general would be a good idea. So these are the questions you want to ask. Will you go with me to get help is great. Will you let me get you help is good. You can call on their behalf. Will you promise not to kill yourself until we found some help? Also good. So the point being, you're staying with them. If you're in a physical place, that's great. It doesn't always happen that way. You don't want to do like oh my God, don't kill yourself, hang on, I'm coming over, and hang up the phone and leave. You want to ensure that they have a specific safety plan, a commitment to safety, before you sign off with them. And that means that they have agreed to it. It doesn't mean that you've asked them to do it and they haven't given you any sort of a commitment. So don't put words in their mouth, but you want to create a very specific plan for the next 30 minutes, 1 hour, overnight, whatever it is, until you can get them to whatever the professional help is going to be. Whether that's they already have a therapist, whether you need to go to a community center, whether you're going to go talk to a religious person. I mean, there are a lot of different places you can go. It really depends on the person. So a lot of times suicidal people believe they can't be helped. You might have to do more. Basically just means like rinse and repeat. You're not going to get rid of people if they're your friends especially, so be prepared to do this several times. But the best thing is to take them there and see them get into it. I say treat these people not like children, but like sneaky teenagers. Like they will make an appointment and then not show up. So schedule coffee around it. They will go into the building, wait for you to leave, and then turn around and go. Like sometimes, it depends. Not all people are like that, but some are. So getting people into actual professional situation, especially people who have had bad therapy experiences before, especially people who as kids got put in therapy because nobody else understood them. They're very resistant to finding proper therapists, proper drugs, which is kind of an art to even find the right kind of drug to match a patient. It's not always a one-hit wonder. So it's not nearly as black and white or easy as 1, 2, 3, as kind of this makes it seem. But if you're there and you do some research, you can manage it. So here's a slide that's a wall of text. It's some resources you can look at in the future. But like I said, almost all attempts to help someone are met with relief. And that's a good thing. So you're offering support, getting others involved, joining a team, following up. This is about distribution of the risk. And you're planting the seeds of hope. This prevents suicide. This ends the licensed portion of our presentation. So, everyone following? All right, good. Now we're gonna get into the nitty-gritty of it. So, crisis intervention is easy. Supporting a depressed friend is hard. Here's the difference between being a crisis intervention hotline volunteer and doing what I like to call friend-tervention. When you work for a hotline, the person in crisis seeks you out. They assume that you are credible and that you are qualified. Your relationship with them has finite bounds, and for the most part, you probably have a lack of personal investment. I mean, you're a volunteer, you're there to help, but it's not literally someone you know. When you're working with your friend sees you as a peer. You might have to confront them first, which can be awkward. They have this idea of this always-on kind of access, maybe. Maybe they know they can hit you up on Twitter, or they can text you, or whatever. Unlike a therapist who has office hours, you are there all of the time. Not reaching you then can make them feel cut off. And then, if their situation doesn't get better over time, if they don't get the help that they need immediately, this might degrade their perception of your credibility. So these are legitimate risks to friendships. But overall, once their situation starts to improve, and I have seen this happen, they will thank you, and they will actually be doing better. It's okay to outline when you're not around with people and say, I don't answer the phone after 10, or say, I'll probably get text in the morning when I wake up. You can still answer and reply if there's some sort of crisis, but you have to respect your personal space as well, because otherwise you're going to end up with emotional exhaustion. And again, there's a difference between helping somebody who's depressed, going through a breakup, is a little bit sad-faced, and helping someone who really has a serious condition that is untreated. You are not an actual psychologist, and you're not going to be able to be for that person as much as you would like to be, unless you want to go get another degree and spend your time helping them. You have to recognize that it needs to be finite. It's not easy. It's easier said than done. But integrity karma, even if they don't feel better today, or you miss a call, or sometimes you think you say something stupid, even if people know that you care, your friends, or even sometimes strangers, as I am finding out now that they know that I do this, will reach out to you when it counts, and it does make a difference. So, here's here's a risk assessment form. This is not, well, I guess it's not the form that you fill in, it's a little different, but this is kind of what you're looking for. This is how we do risk assessment in people. You have three basic groups of risk areas that are considered fundamental. These don't really change. This kind of creates your profile, your own fingerprint of risk. So biologically, you have a genetic load. There are some genetic components to a lot of these mental illnesses. Again, I said that's more of a bar discussion. But if you have a family history of suicide, it's kind of a strong risk indicator. Sexual orientation, LGBT youth, very strongly associated with suicide risk, not because they're actually more likely, but just when they are not accepted by their community. It's about an 8 times risk. So age, we looked at the chart at the beginning. Then you come into the personal, psychological kind of areas. These are things that I like to think of as lint on the sock of life. So this is like stuff you collect over time, but you can't get rid of. I guess you could like call it cannot be unseen. So this is the stuff that once it happens to you, it's yours, and you take it with you. Whether that is your values and religious beliefs, your use of drugs and alcohol, your therapy history, if you had a great experience, a terrible experience. If you're in the military, you think about things totally different than other people. Your career identity, here, that's the kind of thing where we were talking about, was there someone questioning? Yeah.
I'm guessing that domestic abuse would fall under personal psychological, but what about a stressful work environment? Would that be considered more environmental?
Yes. Well, it would fall into multiple categories on this. So career identity, what I'm talking about is like that's who you are. If you consider yourself an InfoSec person who's never going to change, and because of that you have knowledge of things that you're not allowed to talk about that you carry as risk with you, that alters your behavior and the way that you act and your risk profile. If you work at a job that sucks, you can probably quit. That is considered an environmental thing, so that's something that would change. All the environmental stuff are things that you could, kind of situations that you could move out of. And genetic knowledge is kind of an interesting one. This wasn't on the original chart, but I kind of added it in. Genetic knowledge would be your knowledge of your history. So like, since I got my 23andMe, you have to sign a bunch of disclaimers once they tell you stuff. You know, you do act differently once you have the knowledge of things that are your risk factors. So proximal risks, these are the things that once you have this basic kind of risk assessment, this is the stuff that happens to you that would be considered your last straws, and if you are famous enough, the things that they will report are what drove you to suicide, despite, of course, that being erroneous. So loss of freedom, whether that's due to entrapment, imprisonment, legal troubles, it's a big one. Relationship crises, public shame, real or perceived, especially in men, public shame is very strongly related with suicide risk. Loss of a job, or if you're expelled from school. A medical diagnosis, a financial debt, whether it's gambling or the markets or wherever your financial debt comes from. Relapse, if you were in an institution and then you leave, you're very fragile for a while and prone to relapse. And really any major loss. The point being that there's no difference between a perceived loss and a real loss. So once you kind of come through that, you're looking at increasing hopelessness and contemplation of suicide as a solution. Then you have this wall of resistance, which all of my work making that look like brick, you can't actually see on this. It looks like brick, I promise. Okay. And then death on the other side of it. So kind of see it on the screen. So this is the wall of resistance. These are your protective factors, your buffers. These are the things that as an interventionist or when you're talking to somebody, you want to find out so that you can protect them or enlist these people or find a way to create a safer environment for them. So these are the good things. Most of them are pretty self-explanatory. So at the base of that, you can see a sobriety like we talked about before. So when you're actually performing a threat analysis, these are the steps that you go through. The first question you ask is a suicide attempt in progress now? Always, first thing. If it is, you stop and you call 911 immediately. You try to assess if there are firearms present or not, because the EMT response is different. If you are sure that guns are not being used at the time and are not present on the premises, which you may not know, you should also tell them that. Anytime the police are involved and they show up instead of an ambulance, it escalates the situation, and it can be bad. But we're going to assume that the answer was no, and you can continue assessing their risk. So you want to find out what's wrong. The 4 categories are ideation, desire, intent, and capability. So ideation would be, what are they thinking about? Are they thinking about suicide right now, frequently, all the time? This is like all they do all day, which becomes very common. It's almost like an obsessive return, like you would use a healthy thing that you think about, but people think about this suicide like all the time as their escape, like a fantasy. Often teenagers do that in like a romantic sort of fantasy. Desire would be why now. This is where you figure out what their trigger is, the thing that happened. Intent would be figuring out a plan. There's a huge difference in risk between someone who says, maybe someday I would probably take some pills, and somebody who says, yes, I have a loaded gun, or someone who says, yes, I have done research on this medication and I have it stockpiled. And they will tell you. If someone does also have an instrument near them while they're talking to you, it helps if you can get them to set it aside for the time being. And you can also find out if they've done any sort of rehearsals in the past or if they have a prior attempt. Like we said, that's 38 times more likely to indicate a future suicide attempt. So, who is involved? This is where you want to find out whether or not they're actually isolated physically or mentally. And I think we're just going to keep going. So you want to find out if they're physically or mentally isolated, or this works for kids too, like maybe they'll say they're alone but they're not really alone. And then if they have any negative relationships would be risks, positive relationships would be buffers. You want to find buffers in people that can help them. These are the people you're going to enlist when you offload this person into better care. And when you find out why not now, well, if they didn't do it, there's a reason. So you want to find out what that is and latch onto it. This you can read later. It's a whole bunch of wall of text. But there is literally a form that you're filling out as you're doing this threat assessment. And you want to ask as many of these questions as possible, because this is what helps you determine the risk archetype that you're looking at. So if you have someone that you know is currently intoxicated and they have expressed intent to die, they have no planning for the future, it's kind of a mix and match sort of a thing. It helps you determine what the overall threat level is going to be. Also, very important to ask or find out if they have intent of only killing themselves or if they have intent to take someone with them. Very, very common. Yeah. It's relatively subjective. There's this, but it's not a 1 to 10 kind of a thing. It's more of a low, moderate, and high. Mostly because there's not much point in making a distinction between a 7 and a 10. If you think that someone has means and intent, it's not worth fiddling around about a little bit. You take them to a hospital right then. So basically, the only people that you're giving reference information to and like calling it a day are low risk people. But again, you can apply these same kind of tactics to someone who's not in a suicidal crisis. You can talk to someone when they're just upset or even when they're not entirely upset, but just learn about people. I mean, this is the one area where a friend intervention is 1,000 times better than a crisis intervention. Is you know the history of the person, you know what you're getting yourself into, and you're not starting from zero. So this is a question, a corollary that people often ask me about what their legal responsibility is to report if somebody tells them something. The bottom line is probably none. Unless you have a license of some sort, you do not have a legal responsibility to report. You probably have an ethical responsibility, especially if you are maybe working as a social worker. There's this whole thing you have to report if you hear anything. But it's not the same as a legal thing. And like if someone storms out on you and says, if you leave me, I'm going to kill myself, and then you leave, and then they kill themselves, you are not legally liable. You did not make them do that. It is not considered your responsibility. So, are we at time now? Okay. Yeah.
What if you may be aware of firearms being present, but you either forget to or fail to notify, say, EMS? Would you be liable for any
No, I mean, if you're a crisis line volunteer and you're filling out the form and you're in some way negligent in that, it would probably not be good. But if you're talking about getting sued by somebody else involved, but generally no, because you're making a good faith attempt to let them know what you know. I mean, they get calls all the time where people completely misrepresent what's actually going on. You're giving them a lot more information than they usually have to go on. So we're at, I guess at time, I have about 10 more minutes of stuff. So if people want to stay, all right, Chris is saying go. Okay, so now we have the cool stuff. All right, so this was reminded me of Uma Thurman in Pulp Fiction. She says, do you listen or do you wait to talk? And John Travolta says, well, I have to admit, I wait to talk, but I want to learn to listen. Film nerds will know it's not actually in this scene, but it's from the director's cut, and I couldn't get a film still, so deal with it. Okay, so this is how you actually do this conversation. Building rapport and trust, you want to ask one question at a time, give the person time to respond, repeat back what they said as input, as output. It sounds silly, but when someone says to you, like, I feel lonely, you can say back to them, it sounds like you feel lonely. And they will say, yes, you understand. Because when you are in this kind of suicidal mentality or a depressive state, you don't think the same way. You're not able to solve math problems as well, that's been proven. But you don't hear the same things, and you don't rationally make the same judgments that you would otherwise. So you got to speak very simply. Input, same as output. Don't say you don't understand, or don't say you do understand when you don't. They will call you on it. Ask for clarification, that's great. And let them talk. The more they talk, the more stuff you find out. So don't interrupt. Obviously, this is kind of the opposite of the constructive things. Again, rational arguments won't help. Don't minimize and say, don't worry, it's going to be okay, without following that up with something better. Here's an example. The main point and takeaway on this is active listening is not social engineering. So you're not coming into this trying to manipulate someone else into doing something that they weren't going to do. It's not like a you versus them sort of a thing. So here's an example, which you can pretty much read in this color on the screen. So I'll do the shorter one over here. Someone says, I never say the right thing. I don't have friends. No one understands me. Very finite and definitive things. So repeating back what they said, you could say, it sounds like you feel lonely and misunderstood. Does that sound right? And people say, yeah. And then you use that to elicit a protective factor or find out about a threat or risk. So have you ever told anyone else you feel that way? That will get who they talk to, even though they just said they're lonely and they have no friends. Or when you feel like that, what do you usually do? They'll either respond with something that is helpful to them, like, I guess I go to the museum and I watch people. Or they will say, well, I cut myself. So then you've uncovered a threat. So separating facts or states of beings and feelings, this is something, you can kind of, my gray text is gone. I'll tell you what it says. But this is something you can do on yourself, too. This is like your own kind of cognitive thing. You can also use it for other people. When someone says, I am lonely, that's a damning statement. They're also saying after it, basically in the gray there, the corollary, and no one will ever love me. Well, you can change that from an am to a feel, and be, I feel lonely right now, but I could talk to a friend. So you've de-escalated that situation from something that could never possibly change because you are lonely, that is who you are, to something that is a temporary state because feelings do change. Or how about, I am a mess and I could not change even if I wanted to, which is what this one would say. It's actually much more complex than that if you break it down into what they're actually thinking or feeling. Maybe I feel heartbroken, exhausted, furious, overwhelmed. But you didn't always feel this way in the past. You won't always feel this way in the future. And maybe you can't change what happened. And maybe you can't change how you feel about it. That's kind of erroneous to tell somebody, well, change how you feel about it. But you can change how you react to how you feel about it. So this is kind of I put this in here more as like a way that you can kind of convert your own thoughts. It's a little tricky to get people to do this externally, but you can do it. And along with that, it's really useless when someone tells you, I feel sad. It's just as useless as when someone says, I feel depressed, or even I feel suicidal. Even worse if they say, I am suicidal. But it's my favorite English teacher in middle school always told me there's nothing worse than being pretty and nice. So it doesn't mean anything. So you got to take those words and use better words. We all have amazing vocabularies. It is euphemistic and a cop-out to not use them. So I'm so burnt out. This is one you hear a lot. So that could mean a bajillion different things, but it's comfortable and it's okay to say, I feel burnt out with your friends over a beer. It's safe and nobody's going to argue with you about it. Maybe you could take it a little bit farther. I feel exhausted from working all the time and going home just stresses me out more. Still acceptable to say to people. Maybe you start adding a little more vulnerability to that. We can get something we can work with a little more. I feel exhausted from working all the time and angry that I have to be on call 24/7 just to get an ounce of recognition from my boss. And the attitude I take home isn't making my family life any better. And this new guy is eyeing my stapler, that bastard. So here we have unbridled rage and anger. But if you talk to people and you're working on your active listening skills and people trust you, and that's really the key here, is talking to them enough that they trust you, which happens to open up yourself. Maybe you find out the actual root of the issue here. This new guy seems pretty good, and I'm terrified he's going to replace me if I can't prove to everyone I'm on his level. But what if I try to learn this stuff and I find out I'm not as fast as that as I used to be? My family would be so disappointed in me if they knew. I've been shutting them out, and now I feel guilty that this has gone on for so long. I can't bring it up and admit to them that it's all my fault. I think about home when I'm at work and work when I'm at home, and I'm getting nothing constructive done at either. Now, every time someone says, I'm so burnt out, they don't necessarily mean this. But they could mean 1,000 different things, and you don't know what they mean by just saying, I'm burnt out. So, once you get down to the bottom, this isn't the end-all, be-all of what's really the truth, of course. But you at least have some things you can work on. And you have some statements that are concrete that you can refute. This person, assuming in this state, is maybe not necessarily suicidal, but this is just a friend that you're talking to who's burnt out or down. You can work on these statements that are like, my family would be disappointed in me, or I can't tell them. Or, you can start refuting that with well, tell me about a time your wife did understand, or, so you can work with that. And then, finally, solutions. So, making the handoff. This is your goal with someone who's in crisis. Find someone who's protective, get them there. Like I said, treat them like a sneaky teenager. Enlist buffers. I accidentally titled this exploit buffers earlier and I changed it. So distribute risk. You don't want to be a single point of contact. That will mitigates the risk. It spreads it out. It makes you not the only person. You don't want to be somebody's only person. It's really stressful. And then, like I said at the beginning, the crisis plan, you can look at this later, but that I referenced earlier. When you're in an okay state and not in a crisis, make one of these or have somebody else make one of these, and you distribute it out to your friends so they know ahead of time that they're on your call list, and you get them your friends to say, it's okay that I call you. So this is like a pre-plan. You document some things that you can do to when you're feeling down, and it's not just about like, oh, I feel sad, let me go knit. It's about taking the focus out of yourself and being present and doing something external to you, whether that's meditation, whether it's exercise, whatever. It's about acting as if and changing your focus. And HALT that's on there is a common acronym you'll hear. You can use that yourself. It's hungry, angry, lonely, tired. So if any of those ever apply to you, you start to get grumpy and it can escalate. And I think that's it. There's some resources and advocacy stuff. Yeah.
It sounds pretty complicated. And of course, if you're dealing with somebody that's promised, you don't want to make mistakes.
Different scenarios, and some of them are crazy. So, yeah, Josh.
I think it's useful to give everyone here warning signs, but we don't have a very, maybe this is wrong, but it feels like we don't have a very empathetic demographic. So, do you think we should all take training, or do you think we're better for people?
I think that the problem with, I don't think we have an empathy problem, or really even a sympathy problem. I think we have a problem of expression online because we spend so little time in a room with each other. What I was initially attracted to doing the stuff online, it's because I feel like I have an innate ability since I've grown up talking to people in IRC and IM all the time. I feel like I read typing. Maybe that's just my own, feeling that I'm psychic. But it makes just as much sense to me. So it probably depends who you are and how you, if you feel that you lack that empathy, you have to actually ask people stuff directly. I think our big problem is that we talk to each other, but we don't really say things. Looking for changes in patterns of behavior, if people miss appointments or they don't do things that they said they were going to do, or they suddenly getting religion is bad. Or, if they suddenly decide to take a big worldwide journey, like changes are probably the easiest thing. Also, we often know when people change jobs, I guess. We usually know from a positive aspect. I guess people tell us a lot when they get a new job. They don't tell us when they're losing a job. I don't know that there's really a proxy for knowing someone. And that's why it's kind of important to get people to come to you. But if we actually talk ourselves, and this is maybe the hardest part because it's something that we have to do. It's all well and good to say, oh, when you're sad, go talk to somebody. But you have to kind of practice what you preach. And if you actually talk to people or say things publicly that maybe express a hint of vulnerability, I know, it sounds crazy, they will react in kind. And people talk to me and say stuff, I'm like, why would you don't even know me? Because they just think I'm non-judgmental. And I guess also I won't fire them. So, have you discussed any of the other stuff? And I'll try to make the slides available for download when I can. I know there's a lot of content on them, but thank you, everybody.